Hello, everybody. I think we have quite a few people still joining us, but I am going to start just to respect everybody's time here today. I'm going to try to make this introduction as brief as possible. My name is Nelia Viveros. I serve as the Interim Vice Chancellor for Diversity and Inclusion. I've been in that role since May 15th. I welcome you here today to our first social justice teach-in. I was going to reiterate some of what was said in my letter to the university community following the murder of George Floyd and so many other African Americans before him, but I did not know if that was the right thing to say here. In fact, I struggled with the right thing to say. In commemoration of one of our presenters today, Dr. Rachel Harding, who I've had the pleasure of getting to know better, I've settled on opening the session with the words of her late father. Dr. Vincent Gordon Harding made this statement at a town hall on July 12, 2012. Dr. Harding's words said then in 2012 apply to us today. Here they are. We are citizens of a country that we still have to create. A just country, a compassionate country, a forgiving country, a multiracial, multi-religious country, a joyful country that cares about its children and about its elders, that cares about itself and about the world, that cares about what the earth needs as well as what individual people need. Dr. Harding went on to say, I am, you are, a citizen of a country that does not yet exist and that badly needs to exist. As Dr. Harding noted, it really feels like we're all here today because we are citizens of a country that does not yet exist. Before I provide you with an overview of today, I'd like to take another moment to read a formal statement recognizing and respecting the Indigenous peoples as traditional stewards of the land we occupy. Thank you, Gracie Redshirt Tyon, for this. We honor and acknowledge that we are on the traditional territories and ancestral homelands of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Ute nations. The area, specifically the confluence, the Platte and Cherry Creek rivers, was the epicenter for trade, information sharing, planning for the future, community, family, and ally building, as well as conducting healing ceremonies for over 45 Indigenous nations, including the Lakota, Kiowa, Comanche, Apache, Shoshone, Paiute, Zuni, Hopi, and many others. We must recognize Indigenous peoples as the original stewards of this land, and as these words and acknowledgement are spoken and heard, remember the ties these nations still have to their traditional homelands. Let us acknowledge the painful history of genocide and forced removal from this territory and pay our respect to the diverse Indigenous peoples still connected to this land. Let us give thanks to all tribal nations and the ancestors of this place. I wanted to take just a moment to also make a special call out today. Today is June 12th, and it commemorates the 4th anniversary of the mass shooting at the Pulse nightclub in Orlando. There are many people that were instrumental in bringing today's event together. I want to make right now a special call out to Christian Valtiera and James Speed, to our presenters I'm going to be introducing in a few minutes, to all of the facilitators who graciously gave up their time to lead our community breakout sessions, to the Ethnic Studies Department, to the Center for Identity and Inclusion, to the Inclusive Campus Action Network, to 1800 Grant Street, Chief Diversity Officer, Ms. Theodosia Cook for her unwavering support. I'd like to thank Chancellor Sorrell, Chancellor Elliman, and incumbent Chancellor Marks, Senior Vice Chancellor Jennifer Sobonay, and the Provost and Executive Vice Chancellor Rod Nairn for supporting this event and ensuring the leadership voices were present today. And a special call out to Chancellor Harrell for making money available to do this work. There's several staff volunteers from across the campuses. I want to welcome alum, community members, as friends from far afield as Michigan State University and the University of Michigan Medical School. We have over 1,300 people registered for today's main session. Just over 700 of those are registered for the community breakout sessions. Over the next year, the Office of Diversity and Inclusion will be co-hosting a series of these social justice teach-ins. The first of these discussions today is focused on anti-Black violence. We welcome you. I'm going to go over some ground rules before I introduce our presenters. This first session will be recorded and will be made available on the Office of Diversity and Inclusion website. The ground rules that you would have received in your email and when you registered are as follows. I will lean into difficult conversations. I will believe everyone is doing their best most of the time. I will critique ideas, not people. I will use I statements. I will accept a lack of closure. I will not make assumptions about other people's identities. I will take care of myself and take breaks if I need to. I will agree that what is shared here stays here, and what is learned here leaves here. You'll all be muted during the session. Please feel free to use the Q&A that will be monitored. We'll be watching for your questions. Following this main session, if you did sign up for breakout community group, you should have that Zoom information to log into in your email. It won't be this one that we're on right now. And just as a reminder, race is being foregrounded in this presentation today, and those community breakout sessions were broken out based on race as well. These are intended to support those communities through the lenses of the identities for which they signed up and for which they belong. We will be working in breaks as time permits, and we'll try to get you up as much as possible. I'm going to get right now into introducing our presenters. Dr. Rachel Elizabeth Harding is a poet, historian, and scholar of religions of the Afro-Atlantic diaspora. Dr. Harding is the daughter of Dr. Vincent G. Harding and Rosemary Florence Freeney Harding, both of whom were tireless teachers, civil rights leaders, scholars, and healers in their own right. A native of Atlanta, Georgia, Dr. Harding teaches in the Ethnic Studies program of the University of Colorado, Denver, and writes about religion, creativity, and social justice in the experience of communities of African descent in the US and Brazil. Dr. Harding is the author of 2 books, A Refuge in Thunder, A History of the Afro-Brazilian Religion, Candomblé, and more recently, Remnants, a memoir of spirit, activism, and mothering, co-written with her mother, Rosemary Freeney Harding, on the role of compassion and mysticism in African-American social justice organizing. Ms. Kianna Crowe graduated from the University of Colorado, Denver in 2016 as a Puxta Scholar with a bachelor's degree in psychology and ethnic studies, and now works for the Aurora Public Schools as a community school coordinator at Aurora Central High School. Ms. Crowe works to create, strengthen, and maintain the bridge between the school and community. We welcome her here today, both as an alum and as a speaker. Due to a last-minute emergency, Professor Christopher Agee could not be with us today. I'd like to extend thanks to Professor Melissa Tackett-Gibson for filling in at the very, very last minute. Dr. Tackett-Gibson holds faculty appointment in the School of Public Affairs as a senior instructor. She teaches crime and the media research methods and introductory courses in criminal justice and criminology. Dr. Tackett-Gibson completed her undergraduate degree in political science at Marshall University. She earned an MA and PhD in sociology from Northeastern. Her dissertation focused on the impact of state-mandated performance evaluations on nonprofit organizations serving at-risk youth. She's currently engaged in research related to crime and punishment and science fiction and horror films. Thank you all for being here today. I'm going to pass over the session now to our presenters. The first session, again, is going to last for about an hour. We will be asking for your feedback. You will receive a QR code and an email after this session. Please make sure your mics, although I think we have you all muted, so you don't have to make sure your mics are turned off. We'll be watching the Q&A to help the presenters field questions. And without further ado, I yield the floor to Dr. Rachel Harding.
Hello, everybody. I'm very happy to be with you this morning. If you're here in the Denver area, it's now afternoon if you're with us from further east. I'd like to first thank Dr. Viveros and Dr. Faye Coronan for inviting me to do this presentation, and James Speed and the other wonderful folks who are part of the task force who put this teach-in together. We did it in a relatively short amount of time, and it's a powerful group of folks and a powerful set of informations and materials that we're going to be sharing with you. So I'm glad that you all are all here. For the past week, I've been working on what I want to say to you, trying to determine what aspects of the long trajectory of African American history and struggle could be most useful to people who are interested in this extraordinary moment of mass protest, of people who are concerned for the well-being of the Black community and for the future of the nation as a whole. I'm gonna put on the PowerPoint so that you can see what I have gathered as far as images are concerned. The theme of this teach-in is anti-Black violence. And while anti-Blackness has characterized our nation from its founding, and many forms of physical and structural violence have attended that anti-Blackness, there's something about Black people in this country that catalyzes, that triggers, that transforms. And if we are going to talk about anti-Black violence, we must also talk about Black protest, Black resistance, and Black traditions of the creation of alternative visions for this society. So my plan is to offer a very brief commentary on both phenomena, the anti-Blackness and African-American traditions of struggle and transformation. And I hope that they will jointly be helpful to our thinking together about what's happening in our country now. Although the nationwide protests that began 2 weeks ago are a response of needed and justified outrage at the most immediate killings of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and Tony McDade, they're also a response to years, generations of previous murders of Black people in America. And they are a call for a long overdue reckoning with the incalculable abuse and mistreatment people of African descent have experienced in a country whose most consistently inclusive moral leadership has often come from those who were enslaved and their descendants. In some of my courses in recent years, we have looked at the issue of anti-Blackness and the development and now resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement. And I generally begin that section of the course with a discussion of Afro-pessimism and a story about my grandmother. Afro-pessimism is a term coined by writer and critical theorist Frank Wilderson. It is a relatively new theoretical approach in African-American studies that scholars use to try to understand and explain the meaning of Blackness as a concept and the historical and contemporary experiences of Black people in the United States and globally. One of the key tenets of Afro-pessimism is the understanding that the modern world, created from the foundational traumas of colonialism, mercantilism, genocide, and slavery, the modern world is established so completely and so profoundly on anti-Blackness, and that anti-Black racism is so unshakably embedded in all the structures of New World societies, that in order for Black people to truly be free, in order for Black people to be truly recognized as full human beings, in order for Black people to be safe from both the arbitrary and calculated violence of structural racism, the world would have to be completely remade. That's the pessimism part, the overwhelming size and scope of the problem. Perhaps it could also be understood as an extreme realism that recognizes that what ails us cannot be addressed by easy reforms, and that the denial of the humanity of Black people is part of the way US society and the modern world functions. A similar concept articulated by Cameroonian philosopher Akile Mbembe is necropolitics, meaning the construction of power based in a determination of the relative value of the lives of different populations of human beings. That is to say, a form of governing based on the capacity to dictate who is allowed to live and who must die, or subjugating vast populations to conditions of life that mark them with the status of the living dead. Brazilian law professor Antonio Pele writes that in a world where there are more people than modern capitalism can profitably exploit, spaces are created for the confinement of certain populations so that they may be controlled, harassed, and even killed. Spaces such as refugee camps, prisons, favelas or shantytowns, ghettos, and barrios. The idea that some lives are essentially expendable. Now that's some heavy stuff. but it's an approach that helps us understand the level of desperation and determination in the hundreds of thousands of people worldwide who have taken to the streets in response to the most recent killings and in solidarity with Black people's struggles for justice. We can also see some connections to this idea of necropolitics in the lack of urgency and coordinated response to COVID-19 as the pandemic has struck elders and Black, brown, and Native communities. And of course, it's not just the United States that has built and sustained itself on the death and suffering of Black people. Every nation in the Americas and the Caribbean, at some point in its history, enslaved Africans and their descendants. And every nation in the Americas continues that legacy to some extent, whereby Black people and Indigenous people are particularly and structurally disadvantaged, that is to say, on purpose. They are the most discriminated against and suffer most from disparities of all kinds. And although my commentary is focused primarily on the US and can to some extent be extrapolated to other societies in the Americas that had their origins in slavery, like Brazil, for example, it's important to know that there's also a long history of the enslavement of Africans in the Arab world as well as in Europe and Asia. And I'm not addressing that element in my comments today, but that certainly connects to the global phenomenon of anti-Blackness. Bear with me, we're still coming to my grandmother. Now, these are hard concepts to get our minds around at one level, because Afro-pessimism is basically saying that no amount of reform is sufficient if the problem is a system congenitally infected by a fundamental absence of the recognition of Black people's humanity. At another level, it is a prerequisite for the kind of radical, as in from the root, foundational social change that groups like Black Lives Matter are working for. Because if Black folks aren't really free, nobody is. It is also an extremely useful concept when trying to understand calls for defunding the police, for example. Policing in this country is in large part a mechanism for the protection of property and the rights of property owners. The more property you own, the more policing works in your favor, generally speaking. Among the earliest manifestations of policing in the country were slave patrols. Black people called them paddy rollers or patter rollers. These were groups of white men charged with patrolling plantation areas and capturing and often beating and mutilating Black people who were running away from slavery, or who simply didn't have the necessary identification papers required to be away from their assigned locations. Black people were property. Our value in a slave-based society was in what our bodies could produce that was useful or profitable or pleasurable to whites. In an ironic blend of the emphasis of Afro-pessimism and that of necropolitics, the cell phone images of Black torture and death at the hands of police have become a kind of 21st century version of Jim Crowe era lynching picnic postcards, those that were collected and exchanged by white participants as souvenirs of Black grief and emblems like Confederate flags and statues of the supposed supremacy of whiteness. My grandmother, who was born in 1888 in the town of Leesburg in Southwest Georgia, lived to be 104 years old. Her name was Ella Lee Harris Freeney. We called her Mama Freeney. She and my grandfather, Daddy Freeney, and about 24 members of our extended family left the South in the 1920s as part of the largest internal migration in the history of the United States, the Great Migration it's known as, in which 6 million African Americans left the South and moved to industrializing northern, Midwestern, and Western cities for better economic opportunities and to escape the ubiquitous anti-Black violence in their home states. We often think about that violence in terms of the lynchings and massacres that were endemic in the United States at the end of the 19th century and well into the first half of the 20th. In my family's case, there were 2 lynchings, one in Starkville, Georgia in 1916 and one in Valdosta, Georgia in 1918 that precipitated our move. And very briefly, the one in Starkville was the case of a Black man, an older Black man, and 3 of his sons and another Black man, 5 men together, who were hung from the limbs of a single tree and whose bodies were left that way as a kind of warning to the rest of the African American community. And it served as a stark and powerful reminder of the extent of the violence and the extent that white supremacy would go to insist upon itself. Valdosta, Georgia, in 1918 was a case of a pregnant Black woman. She was 8 months pregnant. Her name was Mary Turner, and her husband had been killed, had been lynched. And she was protesting his murder and insisting that those who killed him needed to be brought to justice. And she herself was captured and hung, and her stomach was opened, and her unborn baby was also killed in that way. When those things happened, my grandparents decided that it was time for the family to leave. And so over a period of time, over a few years, as I said, more than 24 of my family members were able to all leave at in that same period. Most went to Chicago, some went to New York, some went to Detroit. But Mama Freeney was the matriarch of our clan. She was a woman both intelligent and wise, and also one who was comfortable with all kinds of people and knew how to handle almost any situation she might find herself in. My mother, Rosemarie Freeney Harding, was the youngest of my grandmother's children, and the 2 of them spent a lot of time together talking about things like politics and philosophy and metaphysics, because they both had expansive minds and they loved to learn and to teach. Well, one day, as I was talking to my mom, probably about the difficult situation African Americans have faced in this country for so many hundreds of years. This is my mother's picture. I don't remember the subject exactly, but I'm guessing that was it. My mom said to me, Mama Freeney used to say, if you really love Black people, you love everybody. My mom said that one way to understand the statement Mama Freeney had made was via the scientific understanding that the original ancestor of all human beings was an African woman. And in that sense, we're all Africans. We are all family. We are all Black people originally. And in order to understand our relation to one another as human beings, we have to recognize that we all share the DNA of our African ancestors. That's one way to think about it, my mom said. Another way to think about my grandmother's statement is this. She was saying that if you can recognize the essential humanity of the people whom white supremacy has most consistently and continually and systematically said you should not love, You should not prioritize. You should not see as fully human. You should not help. You should rather fear and hurt. If you love these folks, then you love everybody. I've been thinking about that statement a lot lately as I look at the protests and see the extraordinary solidarity and sense of empathy and connectedness to Black people's struggle for justice coming from every community in this country and from many places overseas. What is it that people see in this moment, this movement, perhaps, this clamor and insistence on the recognition of the humanity of Black people? My grandmother's statement reminds me of the emphasis on radical diversity, radical inclusivity, radical love that one of the founders of the Black Lives Matter movement, Alicia Garza, described in a 2014 essay on the origins and meanings of the hashtag and the movement. In Garza's words, the organizing principle of Black Lives Matter is Black love. The movement affirms the lives of all Black people, Black queer and trans folks, disabled folks, Black undocumented folks, Black folks with criminal records, women, and all Black lives along the gender spectrum. It centers those that have traditionally been marginalized even within Black liberation movements. It is a tactic to reimagine and rebuild the Black liberation movement. So I'm thinking about what it means to center the marginalized people. How is that good for everybody? I'm thinking about the way this problem of the lack of concern for Black lives is playing out in the COVID-19 crisis. As I said, Black, Native, and Latinx people are disproportionately dying from the virus. And the range of reasons has everything to do with our precarious economic circumstances and the structural racism of the country. Living in redline communities that are food deserts, suffering from ill health and service jobs with little or no access to quality health care, poverty, the racial bias of medical professionals, for-profit medicine, etc. All of these are forms of violence. Kianna Yamada-Taylor, an African-American studies professor at Princeton, who has written widely about the Black Lives Matter movement, noted recently in an essay in the New Yorker magazine, quote, "If we are to have a real conversation about how we change America, it must begin with an honest assessment of the scope of the deprivation involved. Racist and corrupt policing is the tip of the iceberg," unquote. Days after George Floyd's murder, I saw posts on Black Twitter giving some context to the uprisings that had just begun. Danielle Scruggs, a Chicago-based photographer and visual editor, was posting, "Violence is closing mental health facilities, closing hospitals in communities where they are needed, denying equal and adequate medical care in predominantly Black neighborhoods. Violence is redlining. Violence is a multi-million-dollar budget for police misconduct settlements." Her statements and those of others continued. "Violence is closing 50 schools in predominantly Black Chicago neighborhoods. Violence is an absence of grocery stores and access to healthy food in Black communities nationwide. Violence is predatory lending and foreclosures. Violence is evictions. Violence is the war on drugs and the incarceration of massive numbers of Black and brown and poor people. Violence is the system of cash bail. Violence is decimating the Voting Rights Act and insisting that voters in the wealthiest nation in the world stand in line for 5 hours in a pandemic to cast their ballots. If the health of African-American elders, for example, and other vulnerable populations was prioritized, the entire nature of healthcare in this country would be different and everybody would benefit, because our system would have to be more focused on well-being and not on the creation of profits for corporations. There's something about us, Black folks, and our experience in this country. It triggers everything. I was watching the protests on social media for several days straight, and something came to my mind. It seems to me that the fury at the killing of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery and Tony McDade and the many thousands gone is itself and is more too. It's also Katrina fury and Attica fury and Move fury. It's David Walker and Nat Turner and Callie House, and it's grief and fury for Memphis in 1866 and Opelousas in 1868 and Wilmington in 1898. All of these are massacres that occurred of African-American people in the late 19th century. There were others, like some of you may know of the Tulsa massacre that happened just under 100 years ago in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Many of these, unfortunately, are not taught in most American history books, but they are a central piece of what we carry as African Americans, consciously and unconsciously, in terms of our experience in this country. So even if the young people in the streets don't know the names and the places, they do. And in addition to the protests against the murdering and militarized police incarceration state, we are also a nation in shock and trauma at the absolute open plunder by the current administration of what's left of democratic institutions and the national economy and our families, our labor, our health, all of us. Our relatives and friends have been distressed and dying for a long time from the daily incremental meannesses of white supremacy. All of that is part of the fury. And it's not just Black people's fury. What is interesting to me is how in the past 10 years, it has been protests around Black Lives Matter, and in a different but related way, the Standing Rock protest also, that have most deeply galvanized the nation from the grassroots. Black people's struggle in this country is so essential to the meaning of America, so elemental and so powerfully unresolved. And Black people are, in spite of everything, so profoundly determined that we will live and we will be free and we will offer an alternative vision of multiracial democracy to the nation, that we're almost always the catalyst for any fundamental humane change in the country, going back to the abolitionist movement and up through the civil rights and human rights critiques and transformations of the 1960s. We're the bedrock, the bottom, the foundation upon which everything the country claims rests. Black folks and Native folks, we who suffered and suffer still the founding atrocities of American empire, the ones on top of which all the rest of this mess was built. So our struggles are in the DNA of the nation. We are the reminders of the great illness, and we carry the medicine, because there is, in fact, healing for these wounds. And I think America knows instinctively, if not consciously, that if it really wants to get well, it has to come to Black folk for some of the medicine. And in fact, in those historic moments when the country allowed itself, even partially, to follow the leading of Black people during Reconstruction, and in the years of the freedom movement, or the Black Power movement, as the great Southern activist Reverend C.T. Vivian put it, creativity broke out all over like a celestial sun. And the powers that be, from Johnson to Nixon to Reagan on down to today, have been trying to snuff it out with some success, but never complete. never complete. And here we are again with the sun breaking from the fresh graves of George and Brianna and Ahmad and Tony. I want to end my section of this teach-in with a statement about Black Lives Matter that Alicia Garza created to explain to people who are not Black what this means. Hashtag Black Lives Matter, she says, doesn't mean your life isn't important. It means that Black lives, which are seen as without value within white supremacy, are important to your liberation. Given the disproportionate impact state violence has on Black lives, we understand that when Black people in this country get free, the benefits will be wide-reaching and transformative for society as a whole. When we are able to end hypercriminalization and sexualization of Black people and end the poverty, control, and surveillance of Black people, every single person in this world has a better shot at getting and staying free. When Black people get free, everybody gets free. This is why we call on Black people and our allies to take up the call that Black lives matter. We're not saying Black lives are more important than other lives, or that other lives are not criminalized and oppressed in various ways. We remain in active solidarity with all oppressed people who are fighting for their liberation, and we know that our destinies are intertwined. I think, now this is me speaking, I think this is what the hundreds of thousands of people who have joined the protests in the streets and who have added their names to letters and statements condemning the state-sponsored murders of Black men and women and children, I think they understand what Garza is saying. I also think there is a deep, perhaps subterranean understanding in this country and in the world that the structures of this society are gravely unfair. And that in fact, as legal scholar and activist Michelle Alexander said recently in the New York Times, our democracy is right now hanging in the balance. Historically, when we have been at this kind of a crossroads in the nation, a crucible of racial justice and democracy, African Americans have been the fulcrum, the hinge, the pivot. And it has been Black people and folks who felt a profound connection to the struggles of Black people who have led the country in the direction of healing and toward the imagination of new humane possibilities. We are facing another such opportunity now to remake our nation in the image of all of us, in the image of all humanity. Our country is more richly diverse than it has ever been, and we have the benefit of the experiences, the wisdoms, and the histories of everybody who's here. Many people see that something is profoundly wrong. They also recognize that Black people have been speaking out and calling the attention of the nation to this problem for a long time, centuries. I believe the radical inclusivity, the radical wisdom, the courage, and the radical love that have guided the best of the African American tradition and the best of Native traditions and the best of Asian American Pacific Islander traditions and the best of Latinx traditions of struggle and solidarity and the best of white anti-racist organizing traditions and the best of queer and LGBTQ organizing traditions. All of these offer the closest thing we have to a solution. Excuse me. My hope is that we can use this historical moment to learn, to connect with one another, to reflect, and to demand of our institutions and of ourselves new solutions that honor all our humanity and don't leave anybody out. We have to find a way to heal from racism, from white supremacy, from anti-Blackness, from anti-indigeneity, from greed, and from fear. We have to imagine and create together an America that, as my daddy would say, has not yet been, but needs to be. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Harding. I'm going to invite Professor Tackett Gibson to come on next.
Hi, and thank you, Dr. Harding. I find myself strangely moved in ways that I've not been lately, particularly since the protest. And so thank you for those words. They help me make sense of some of the events that we've seen. I've prepared some initial thoughts for this presentation, and I'd like to read some of those to you today. First of all, just as some biography, I grew up in a small industrial town, factories, coal, steel, along the Ohio River. It was a hub, my town, Ironton, Ohio, close to Canova, West Virginia. Some of those other small cities along the river were hubs along the Underground Railroad. And in grade school, I can remember touring these grand homes and seeing the tunnels that led to the Ohio River where slaves would cross. We learned about the network of abolitionists in the area, and when I was in high school, we would even get a little mischievous and sneak in and tour some of the tunnels ourselves. And it was scary and exciting. And while I was proud of the history of my town, we were on the right side of the Civil War. Slavery and those tunnels for me were really a historical novelty, not something that I processed as necessarily a real event, but I was entertained in some ways by those tunnels. I moved to Boston for work and graduate school. I lived in a basement apartment on Beacon Hill, and behind a shaky, really old closet door were tunnels that connected all the homes along Beacon Hill. And that north slope of Beacon Hill had been a thriving Black community during the 19th century. It housed the first Black public school in the United States. The African Meeting House there on Beacon Hill regularly hosted events with Black leaders and intellectuals. Frederick Douglass was a common person that you would see on and would present at the African Meeting House there. And it was also a major destination on the Underground Railroad. That's why there was a tunnel system all along that north side. Blacks on the Hill raised money and they organized slave rescues. Escaped slaves were offered homes in Boston. They were hidden from slave patrols in those tunnels. And the tunnel at the back of my closet led to this network. I felt connected to history by living there. I had a good story to tell. That tunnel was still a novelty. Now, I don't typically shy away from issues of race or from trying to understand the experience of minorities in the United States, but being white in America does mean that you have a completely different lived experience than Blacks and other minorities. I could treat the tunnels as a historical tourist attraction, and that was a privilege I had. I didn't have to grapple with what those tunnels really represent on a daily basis. In fact, I was asked if I was afraid to have that tunnel in my closet. How can you sleep knowing someone could get in? People were worried I would be victimized, not about the legacy that was left by hundreds of years of victimization that those tunnels represented. I received concern from friends and family, and now I wonder, who did they think would victimize me? What was the race of the potential perpetrator that would go through those tunnels in order to offend, not to hide? So the real victims of those tunnels were ignored. And to be honest, I didn't really begin to think about them until I was an adult, post-graduate school. I didn't begin to personalize those tunnels and see people in those tunnels in a new and meaningful way. When I moved to Texas, it was the first time I was 27, an adult. I first learned of Juneteenth. When I was 28, I first learned about the Tulsa Massacre, and that was by accident. I happened to be watching a TV show, and Tavis Smiley had a special about the Tulsa Massacre, and I was shocked that I'd never heard of this information before. It was in my 40s that I read an article about one of the last lynchings of the United States. And in that article, people in that community were interviewed about their remembrances of that lynching. And in that article, for the first time, I realized the felt pain of African Americans in fearing what might happen to them, even today when they talked about that lynching, a persistent and constant fear. I watched the coverage of the killing of James Byrd in Jasper. That trial, the death penalty trial, occurred in the town I lived in Texas. I followed the case of Sandra Bland in Waller, Texas, 20 minutes from where I lived. And I realized that the Black experience in the United States was not just an experience of economic oppression, of voting disenfranchisement. It was one marked distinctly by fear and violence. Today, my hometown only has 5% Black population. Beacon Hill only has 2% Black population. So two of the most formative places in my life were inhospitable to minorities. Why did slaves escape after crossing the river? Why did Beacon Hill, why is it now a white wealthy community? Why are Black neighborhoods in Boston, Roxbury, Dorchester, Mattapan, known for crime and drug use, for broken windows? And why has the Black experience in the U.S. been one of exclusion, specifically fear and violence? These are systemic questions. And when I think about those tunnels, I often think that's where those answers will lie, the answers to those systemic questions. Many scholars have argued that policing in the United States began with slave patrols. Gary Potter is a crime historian who links the creation of formal law enforcement with the violent control of slaves. Dr. Harding mentioned those slave patrols. They were formed, the first one was formed in 1704. And the groups grew in number and power until abolition. These patrols had authority even in northern states for decades prior to the Civil War. According to Potter, slave patrols and night watches had three main functions: to chase down, apprehend, and return the owners their runaway slaves, to provide a form of organized terror to deter slave revolts, and to maintain a form of discipline for slave workers who were subject to summary justice. Sadly, we see parallels in modern day policing today, particularly in policing of the protests in recent days. To apprehend, to chase down, to provide organized terror, to deter revolts and protests, to watch and discipline those subject to the laws, the bodies of those subject to the laws. It's not by accident we see physical violence. The bodies are policed and disciplined. Perhaps these aren't just parallels, but they're the natural progression of a system built on surveillance and the control of Black bodies and actions. Now, I should be clear, I teach criminal justice. I've known a lot of law enforcement officers and correctional officers. They've been my students. Some have been my friends. And my attitudes towards law enforcement have dramatically changed since I joined the criminal justice faculty. And I've been teaching criminal justice and sociology for the last 15 years. My attitude towards the police coming into criminal justice was probably a lot like that of the protesters. They're bad. I don't like them. They're complicit in an unjust system. Once I began to understand that system, I began to realize that these issues are far more complex, and it'll take far more sophisticated answers in order to solve the problems of policing today. There are good people in law enforcement, but I reject the bad apples analogy. It's a red herring. I've known, it assumes that there are no structural issues that need to be addressed. It assumes that if we get rid of bad apples, everything will be better, and that's simply not true. There are a host of reasons why officers resort to actively engaging in violence against the public. Some suggest that job stress and crisis events, particularly responding to suicide calls, precede excessive use of violence. Others have studied organizational culture, the role of leadership, lack of training, implicit bias, and they're all factors that might contribute to police violence. But ultimately, we believe that if we believe that consequences deter the public from committing crime, then we should also assume that consequences will prevent the police from committing crime. Now, I'm going to just quickly go through several policy issues that need to be addressed in order to improve policing in the United States. And I'm taking this from a group called Campaign Zero. DeRay McKesson, you're probably familiar with that name, Sam Sinyagwe, were activists in the Black Lives Matter movement after Ferguson, and they've gone on since 2014 to try to provide a research-based solutions to police violence. And what they argue is that it won't be simply addressing organizational culture. It won't be simply addressing leadership, or it won't be simply providing training on implicit bias and on working with special populations. But it's a combination of policies that are quickly addressed, that are consequences that quickly take place, along with these policies and the policy changes that actually change policing. Okay, so they provide 8 real changes that have a verifiable impact on reducing police use of force, and they call them 8 Can't Wait. And you can find this online, a hashtag 8 Can't Wait. Some of you are probably already familiar, but I'll show you what those are, and I'll very quickly go through those. Okay, the first is ending broken windows policing. Broken windows policing is a strategy that tries to crack down on small types of crime with the expectation that it will prevent larger types of crime. So graffiti, marijuana possession, drinking in public, jaywalking, all of these become the goals of community policing, which is a very popular model of policing right now. Campaign Zero argues that when we begin to crack down on small crimes, we begin to criminalize the regular activities of individuals in their communities. And this doesn't support, or we come into more encounters where police are in the position of, or have the opportunity to act violently. And we see that's exactly what happened with George Floyd in that situation. So ending broken windows policing is critical to changing the system. Community oversight and systems of community oversight, they invite community members to be those who help provide some kind of review of police acts of violence, review of police uses of force. When those reviews are internal to the police force itself, to the police or agencies themselves, we find the consequences that we've always had, that investigation is private. It generally comes to nothing, and people are left without any good resolution of those events. We limit the use of force, so chokeholds become illegal. Incidences when uses of force are considered, I'm sorry, I can't see my notes while I have the slideshow on, but limiting the use of force and opportunities for the use of force is one of those methods as well. Let me go back to my notes really quick. I'll stop sharing. Pardon me. First of all, again, in terms of use of force, 255 unarmed people were killed by police in 2014. 91 died after ordinary traffic stops. So they argue that consequences should occur in case in every case except when an imminent threat is defined. And they argue that defining an imminent threat is important for all police forces, so that a police stop is not considered an imminent threat unless there is clear evidence of a weapon being used against the police. Now, so defining an imminent threat and only allowing or only permitting the use of force when that threat is clear and obvious is one of those reforms. Public reporting of police killings and injuries. In Colorado in 2015, this became a law in our state. So we do have a public reporting, and then data. We actually collect data. Now the FBI has developed a new database on police uses of force. Currently, that's not federally mandated, that all police departments or law enforcement agencies report to that data set. They do report information on the number of arrests and the conclusions of those arrests, the types of those arrests, but they don't collect information on policing itself, on the acts of policing. So the FBI database, which is relatively recently developed, if we could get more buy-in or even state mandating reporting is important, and acting to calling our congressman, calling our governor to try and, or in other states, if you're from another state, is important to encouraging law enforcement agencies, mandating law enforcement agencies to report to this data set. Paul Taylor is a faculty on our in the School of Public Affairs. He has shown that even by training police to just hold their weapons lower, that increases their response time enough for their processing, that there are fewer errors in police use of force simply by lowering your weapon. So that we can prevent or limit the use of force, even in terms of very pragmatic methods of training. So small changes can make big changes in terms of limiting the use of force. They argue for independent investigations and prosecutions, that each state should have a special prosecutor that's not tied to a local police department that would handle the investigation of police violence cases. They argue that police forces should diversify and reflect the communities that they police. Research has found that when police departments have more African American officers, they kill fewer Black people in their communities. So very few, that threshold is about 35–40% African American. Then you begin to see real effects on the lives of Black people in those communities. Very few police departments have that high percentage of African American police officers. They argue that mandatory body cam use and then mandatory that the police officer doesn't have discretion to turn off that body cam, or they would be punished if they turn off that body cam, is an important reform. In Colorado, again, as of 2015, it's illegal in Colorado for an officer to turn off a body cam. It's also illegal for a police officer to take a camera from the public. So recording the police, you can't in Colorado take that phone or destroy that phone and try to prevent the public from recording police actions. Consistent training does help. There's an average of 58 hours of firearm training, only 8 hours of de-escalation training. So increasing the hours of training for de-escalation is important. Ending for-profit policing. Even if we have a public police department, there are many things that those police departments do to generate income for their local governments, for county governments, and then for the prosecutor's office and their own police department. Ending asset forfeiture of the police. Believe any assets that have been found have been used in the commission of crime. They can possess those assets. They can control those assets. Generally, those assets are split between a prosecutor's office and a police department. So there's incentive for them to seize assets. Once assets are seized, it's very, very difficult for the person to prove that those assets weren't used in a crime. The burden of proof is very high in order to get your assets back. They argue that ending asset forfeiture and only being able to seize assets, or changing policies that require police departments to actually charge and convict a person of a crime in order for those assets to be seized is quite important, because right now we have an incentive to over police. We have an incentive to pull over people and seize their cars and seize their money. And in fact, there are plenty of instances that the ACLU has picked up where people have been pulled over and their money seized simply because there's been a suspicion of drug trafficking. So this is a real problem and provides an incentive for over policing. And then they argue that ending the militarization of police is important. The military, the Department of Defense, sells excess military equipment to law enforcement agencies. Those recent studies have shown that militarized departments are more likely to kill civilians. They're even more likely to kill dogs. It just simply promotes more violence and an overreaction by the police. High level of spending on militarization increased civilian deaths. The study was done in Nevada by 129%. So money, we need to end federal money for the purchase of military equipment for local police departments. We need to end state funding of military equipment for police departments. And some even suggest that we need to encourage a federal government buyback of some of this equipment in order to deter police from overreacting to these and using SWAT units for very ordinary offenses. So those are some limiting police unions and their ability to negotiate protections, even for those who commit use of force, are some of those policy changes that they would like to make. So I think when we think about police violence, we need to take, I'm emotional about the issue as well, but there's also room for pragmatism, and there's room for advocacy, and there's room for us to begin to come up with real solutions that can change policing and can have a real impact on communities of color in the United States. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Professor Tackett-Gibson. I know we're up against the hour. Thank you for bearing with us. We do have some cushion time built in, and we have one more speaker left. And then Professor Tackett-Gibson, there are some questions that are coming in the Q&A. I just wanted to point that to you, so maybe we can address those as we're finishing up. I would like to welcome Ms. Kianna Crowe now.
Hello, everybody. My name is Kianna Crowe. I currently work for the Aurora Public Schools District as the Community School Coordinator at Aurora Central High School. So I was invited here today to talk about my experience and protesting and some of the thoughts of what's going on. So who would have thought that in 2020 that we'd be in the middle of a civil rights movement and a global pandemic? When I first saw the links to the videos of George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery, I refused to watch. I remembered the videos in the past like Philando Castile and Eric Gardner and how heartbreaking they were. A couple of days went by and conversations in social media began to buzz. More recent names started to come to light like Sean Reed, Breonna Taylor, and even Elijah McClain from Aurora, Colorado. So I went online and watched these videos, and if you have not seen these videos, I would in no way recommend you going to find them. But I will tell you, when I saw the video of George Floyd, what I saw was a grown man crying for his mom. And all I could think about was my 3-year-old son and how I would soon have to have the talk with him. I'll have to tell him he's not beige, because if you ask him what color he is, he'll hold up his arm and say, "I'm beige." And I'll have to teach him about the construct of race, and then the world that he lives in sees him as Black. And with that comes a conversation of how to act with the police. So the protests began with the notion of violence in police escalated situations. The media showed images of cities up in flames and highlighted protesters as rioters and looters. Now, I hope I can paint a better picture for you, because as the media shows cities up in flames, in Denver, the protest was confined to a few blocks around the Capitol building and mostly peaceful. There was a large, diverse crowd. About 2 weeks ago, an 8 p.m. curfew was issued on the city. And 3 hours before the curfew, the air became filled with tear gas. Children and protesters were shot with rubber bullets and pepper balls, some even shot in the face. There was a young white man protesting, and he was shot point blank right in his temple with a rubber bullet and fell down and began to seize. My brother leaned over to help the man who was shot and picked him up to carry him to some medics nearby, and my brother was shot on his way helping a man that was shot. So days later, the protests began with moments of silence, people calling out names to those lost to police brutality. I walked around and I found a very beautifully drawn chalk mural of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd, and I just grabbed some chalk and just began writing names. And as I wrote names for about an hour, I realized there were hundreds of more names left, and I actually began to cry a little bit. The Capitol had spray paint along the walls and on the steps, and someone climbed to the top of the statue in front of the Capitol and taped a Black Lives Matter sign onto his hands. Despite the spray paint, the city was pretty clean. There were people volunteering to put out trash bags and recycling, and even scrub the spray paint off of the walls. So it seemed as if once the police backed down, the presence of violence was no longer even existent. During a global pandemic, people were volunteering their time to pass out masks, hand sanitizers, first aid kits, community resources, while the SWAT team rode around the block in the back of trucks dressed in riot gear. President Obama made some comments about protest versus policy and emphasized that we need to take a look at policy. He then challenged our mayors to make changes and review the use of force policy and to commit to actual planned reform. Dr. Angela Davis said, "The challenge of the 21st century is not to demand equal opportunity to participate in the machinery of oppression. It is to identify and dismantle those structures in which racism continues to be embedded." So it's amazing that we were able to get the whole world's attention with our protests. Now let's address systemic racism and commit to systems change, not only within police, but within education, immigration policy, public housing equity, infant mortality, hiring discrimination, sexual harassment, and colorism, just to name a few. So in education, we often talk about equity, and we cannot address equity without first addressing racism. The media is now showing government officials kneeling in solidarity and people crying in arms of the police officers. However, this is not the end. To make structural change, we have to continue to have these uncomfortable conversations. Thank you.
Thank you, Kianna. There's some questions, Kianna, I just wanted to point to the Q&A that you might help us answer. I also, so we're at the end of our first part of our presentation. Thank you for bearing with us. We've gone a little bit over time, but the content was rich. Thank everybody for being here today. I want to thank Dr. Harding. I want to thank Dr. Tackett Gibson. I want to thank Kianna Crowe for bravely coming forward and talking about her experience. I'd also like to thank again the planning committee who put this together, all of the people who made today possible. This was literally put together in 2 weeks. We'll be sending you a short survey by email, and I believe a link is being made available in the Q&A at some point. For those of you that signed up, just looking at the time, we do have these breakout community facilitated sessions that were supposed to start at 12:15. I'm going to ask that we push that back to all the facilitators and we start at 12:20 to get people up, stretching, grab a coffee, water, and get yourselves ready, and then we'll run till about 1 o'clock with those. You would have, if you've signed up for those community sessions, you would have that link in your email. We do have control set up to avoid harming other members of the community. Each facilitator is given that ability. Now I ask you to get up, stretch, grab a coffee, water, a quick snack, and be ready to join your next community at 12:20. And we'll try to deal with any remainder Q&As. But thank you for being here. I think the recording will stop pretty soon. Thank you, everybody.